I doubt anybody else is either.
Okay, I'm just muting anyone who's not muted right now. I'm hearing any background noise. Okay, so this is class number 2 about the Seder. In our first class last week, we addressed the Seder plate, the 4 cups of wine, reclining, maror, harosas, and karpas. In tonight's class, I'm going to focus on matzah and the magid. And matzah comes along with that. There is also the afikoman, and we'll touch on the shank bone a little bit. So going in order, before getting to magid, the last thing we do before magid is yachatz. And that is where we take that middle matzah of the 3 matzahs. We got 3 matzahs. We take that middle matzah and we break it in half. Now that is a really significant thing to do because we need that to have real matzah. Now what do I mean by that? The Gemara tells us that matzah is lechem oni. It's bread of affliction, poor man's bread. And the Gemara says a poor man, he doesn't have whole loaves of bread. A poor man has pieces of bread. That's what a poor man has. So for it to be real lechem oni, it has to be broken in half. So that's why we break the middle matzah, and that's a very significant thing to do. The larger of the 2 halves is wrapped up and then put away for the afikoman, and we'll discuss the details of that later on. And then with the matzahs present, we proceed with the magid. So the magid is a mitzvah from the Torah. It is a mitzvah of yigadata lebincha, of telling the story literally to your son. But as the Haggadah itself tells us, it's not only if someone has children, it's any time you have 2 people together, they're teaching each other, or even an individual is kind of teaching himself. So that's a mitzvah of magid. And the Haggadah, it's important to recognize that the Haggadah is really very much like a Mishnah. It was composed by a Tana, by an author of the Mishnaic era, and it has the same level of depth that a Mishnah has. So we have to treat it accordingly. A couple of things to have in mind, to be aware of as we're going through the Magid. The Magid, it's hard to balance your pace, right? You want to get into it. You want to have some degree of depth, but if you let it drag on for too long, then your meal ends up getting very late, and it gets to be overbearing, and people start losing their focus and their engagement, and that's really not worth it. It's much better to stick to a basic understanding and to keep it lively, to keep yourself and whoever else is at the table focused and engaged. That's really much more critical than getting into all of the myriads of beautiful Divrei Torah that come along with the Haggadah. And for someone with little kids, that there's an added challenge that every kid's got their whole thing from school. So that's also something to bear in mind. You wanna tailor your Seder to whoever you're with. Now this year is interesting because this year everyone's making their own Seder. So we don't have, it's likely that we're going to have a very different audience, if any audience, than we normally do. It's going to be our own family. So for someone who has small children, it's going to be all about them because there's nobody else there. It's you and them. For older couples, it's a much more sophisticated level. It's a whole different type of Seder that you can have. And I encourage you to take advantage of this unique scenario and really make the most of it. Tailor your Seder to yourself, to your own family, to you, your spouse, whoever you're with, and make sure that it's the most that it could be. It's important to try to bring the text to life. You know, it's easy to kind of read through it and just read it over and, okay, I'm not sure what that means, and just keep reading. We want to be careful not to do that. We want to try to bring the text to life. And songs are really important. There's a lot of traditional songs that, you know, everyone has in their families, they've been doing it for years. And it gives you that kind of deep connection to the Seder, like this is my tradition. And that has a lot of significance. I do want to put in a warning there that it's very easy to let that consume your Seder, and that the entire Seder is sing-song with very little depth. And for children, maybe that's appropriate. But this year, we have a lot of people that are not necessarily going to have any children with them. And that might seem hard in certain senses. You know, you're missing that kind of cute element, but take advantage of it. You know, have a Seder that's on your own level. You know, I would recommend you try to make the most of that and see the opportunities that are there. In terms of the depth, I would recommend that you try to focus on the story and on the core beliefs, as opposed to the technicalities. You know, there's a lot of, you can ask a question on every line of the Haggadah. You know, why were they sitting in Bnei Brak? Why Bnei Brak? Why not Yerushalayim? Right? You know, endless questions that could be asked. And all these questions reveal very interesting things. And it's all worth our attention. But the night of the Seder itself, we want to zero in on what we're trying to accomplish. And what we're trying to accomplish is the preservation of our Masorah, of our tradition, of our beliefs as Jewish people. And our most fundamental beliefs are that Hashem himself took us out of Egypt. He made us his nation. And that is what we want to focus on. And included in that is how he did it. And all the amazing kindness that he offered us, and everything that he did and continues to do, and which all plays into our emunah, our faith in Hashem, at all times. There are a lot of, in terms of getting engaged, keeping people engaged and focused, there's a lot of like fun things that people do, getting dressed up for the makos and little props. And, you know, it's worthwhile to be creative, especially if you have little kids. Chazal themselves, in the Gemara themselves, go out of their way to make adjustments so that the children should be as engaged as possible. For example, starting the Seder as quickly as you can so that it shouldn't get too late for them. Doing strange things, intentionally strange things, so they should ask questions. Shulchan Aruch even brings down that you should have treats that you should dispense over the course of the Seder to keep people engaged. I was at a Seder once, I'm trying to remember if I was actually at the Seder, or I think it was the Seder I was at. I'm not remembering whose it was. But the candies were given out to the kids for questions, not for answers. I thought that was brilliant. So, you know, think outside the box, be creative, and make the most of it. One thing that I was thinking of that I think is especially relevant this year is Dayenu. I had an interesting conversation with Mrs. Tova Kirshner this past Erev Shabbos, and we were talking about how everyone is adjusting to the realities of not being able to get all the food and all the supplies as easily as you would typically be able to get it on a regular year. And she commented that people's expectations are totally different. You know, people are happy that they can get a few dozen eggs. That's like already an accomplishment. You know, they're not worried about the kosher Pesach chocolate bar that they weren't able to get. You know, that's not on people's minds. And it's perhaps a positive thing to adjust our expectations and to appreciate the significance of everything. Mrs. Winter, did you want to add something?
No.
Okay, no problem. So I was just when I was thinking over that thought, it struck me that that's Dayenu. You know, a significant part of the Seder is where we have the Dayenu stanzas, where we say, if Hashem would have done this one little thing, that would have been enough. If he would have done the next thing, that would have been enough. And it's important to appreciate in our own lives the many Dayenus that we have in our own lives. You know, if Hashem would have, you know, given me something very basic, that would have been enough. If he would have given me that little extra thing and nothing else, that would have been enough. And to kind of go through that, to appreciate, I think at this time where we're much more confined and we're not able to enjoy a lot of the things that we typically enjoy, it's worthwhile to give a little extra reflection to that Dayenu element and to appreciate every little thing that Hashem provides us. Okay, so those are some basic thoughts about the Magid. There isn't really a lot more to discuss about the Magid. You follow the Haggadah and you do your best to get into it and to really feel it and understand it. Towards the end of the Magid is one of the most important parts of the Magid, which is Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, where we discuss the significance of those three things: the Korban Pesach, the Matzah, and the Maror, the bitter herb. And that brings us to the next discussion for tonight, which is the mitzvah of matzah, of eating matzah. So the mitzvah of eating matzah is, I believe, the only mitzvah that we have today from the Torah to eat something in particular. We have mitzvahs to eat as in form of celebration and other similar types of scenarios. But to have a specific item where there's a mitzvah to eat that item, that is not something that we typically come by. In the times of Beis HaMikdash, it was commonplace. There was karbanos in the Korban Pesach that everyone brought. And karbanos include eating in many, many scenarios. Every Yom Tov, you had special meat, special sacrificial meat that specifically that is supposed to be eaten. So it's a very unique mitzvah, very unique opportunity, a mitzvah of eating something. So let's talk about some of the halachas of the matzah. Number one is the matzah for the mitzvah of achilas matzah of the Seder needs to be shmura matzah. The rest of the matzah of Pesach does not need to be shmura matzah. Many, I think is an overstatement. Some people have a chumrah to eat shmura matzah the entire Pesach through, which is a pretty pricey chumrah. So I would urge you to consider that heavily before taking that one on. And there are two types of shmura matzah. There's hand shmura and there's machine shmura. When machine shmura was first being produced, it was a very controversial topic because a halachic question was raised whether its production through machinery would invalidate its status as being made for the sake of a mitzvah. Because it's not being made by a person. It's a machine is cranking it out. So how can you attribute any specific intent to a piece of machinery? That was the question that was raised. Many tshuvas were written in those years. And the consensus today in the majority opinion is that it is acceptable to use machine shmura. Some even prefer it. Some even prefer machine shmura because the machine matzah production system leaves much less room for error as far as chametz is concerned. The possibility of it waiting too long and things not going as planned and it actually becomes chametz before it's baked, or something that's chametz dik gets mixed in, is extremely low because it's a mechanical system which is synchronized by machinery. So there is that factor as well. Nonetheless, certainly the preferred matzah is hand shmura. I think a lot of people prefer it just simply because it has that authentic matzah experience. It's just machine matzah is just not the same. I think we can relate to that. But halachically speaking, there is a little bit of a benefit, but it is certainly not a requirement. But shmura is absolutely a requirement. So now we have our shmura matzah, and then we're going to eat it while we recline, and that's, as we mentioned before, leaning to the left. How much matzah do we need to eat? Which matzah do we take from? How much time do we have to eat it, and how should we eat it? These are the really important eating matzah questions. So question number one is, how much matzah do we eat? So there are these charts that I think most of us have seen with the different boxes, and every different organization, they've got their own colors, and they do it this way, they do it that way, and however they like to do it. Some of them put little, they put like matzah background on the matzah one and the maror background on the maror square, whatever the case may be. Typically those charts are erring on the side of caution, as with almost anything that is put out in very, very public ways in the realm of halacha. And in reality, I think in general, they're more machmer than one needs to be in terms of the amount of matzah you need to consume. And I think it's important to bear that in mind for people that have a hard time eating lots of matzah. A lot of people have a hard time eating lots of matzah, especially when you're eating a lot of it in one time. So it's important to bear in mind that those charts might be a little bit on the machmir side, but if you don't have trouble with it, it's definitely an easy solution. Now, in terms of the exact amount of matzah, there are significant halachic questions that play into the calculation and make it create room for variation. That's why you'll see different precise amounts. Just as a sidebar, precision with kizesim in general is something that I personally take a little bit of issue with. It's just hard for me to believe that in the times of the Gemara, people were walking around with measuring cups and with charts and boxes, and were smashing things into little measuring cups and putting things against charts. And you ate a kazayas. A kazayas is a kazayas. Everyone has a general sense of approximately what a kazayas is, and that's what you eat. End of story. So I have a sense that I personally feel that absolute getting to the perfect tea is something you should kind of tone down your concern on. Eleanor, it looks like you have something you want to add.
I do. We don't have anything here with us. We didn't expect to be here. So would you say a kazayas of matzah is the size of a dinner plate, is the size of half a dinner plate? What kind of an approximation would you give us for the round matzah? Okay,
so here we go with the approximations. So the bottom line, I'm going to go with a Rav in Baltimore who's a tremendous Talmid Chacham that I have a close relationship with. This is Rabbi Yosef Berger. He
That's what's the price.
says to use for the motzi matzah, he says approximately 2/5 of a hand matzah, which to most people sounds small. If that's a hard thing for you to estimate, a little less than a half. Think of a little bit less than a half of a hand matzah. That should give you a good sense of what that is. So that's, again, 2/5 of a full hand matzah. But again, this is only for the motzi matzah. We'll see for other things it is less. Okay? So that would be the approximate amount to work with. Now, how quickly do I need to eat it? If you eat it like little tiny piece after piece after piece, and it stretches out, that's not one eating. That's 2 or 3 or 4 different eatings. And in halacha, that breaks up your kazayas, and then you lose your mitzvah. So you need to eat it in what's called the amount of time of kidei achilas pras. Without getting into all the details of what that means, bottom line is between 4 and 6 minutes would be. This is again following Rabbi Berger's recommendation. You'll find numbers as small as 2 minutes and as long as 9 minutes in different poskim, the Chassam Sofer and the Mogen Avram and others. But if you can get it in within 4 minutes, that's great, and that would be good enough. L'chatchila. If that's hard for you, try to at least get it all down within 6 minutes. And something a lot of people are, what helps a lot of people is the fact that you may drink a little sip of water along the way, if that's going to help. You shouldn't be eating anything else with your matzah, but water is okay. A little sip of water is fine. And that'll definitely help it down. There is a chumrah for those who are capable of it. It's the Mogen Avram, and it's brought down in the Mishnah Berurah to try to eat the kazayas in one shot, like to swallow it in one shot. The only way to do that is you chew it all up, get it all in your mouth, all chewed up before you start swallowing, and you swallow it all down one shot. So yeah, that is ideal if that is something that's not difficult for you to do, but the general minhag is not to be that machmir. Typically speaking, if you've got more than 2 people at your Seder, oh, there you go. We've got if you put your screen on gallery mode, you'll see everybody's picture, and you'll see one of the charts being held up to the screen.
That's your father?
Yep, there he is. Thank you for joining, Dad. Thank you for sharing that chart. All the way, one of the unique advantages of this unusual scenario of being in isolation and being forced into a Zoom platform is that we can have people in Cincinnati, people in Florida, and people in Buffalo all at the same share at the same time, which is pretty amazing. But moving on with the matzah, you want to take, if your Seder's only got 2 people at your Seder, you could probably get all your matzah from the top 2 matzahs. That's what you want to do ideally. You want to get a kazayas out of, you want half of your matzah to be from the middle one, so that'd be approximately 1/5, and then the other half of what you're eating to be from the top matzah. And the reason for that is because the top matzah is your lechem mishnah matzah. It's your quote-unquote hamotzi matzah. And the middle matzah, as we discussed, that's the one that is for your mitzvah of eating matzah. So that's why you want 1 kazayas from the top matzah and 1 kazayas from the middle matzah. That is the ideal scenario. It is, when you have a lot of people at the table, it's not, you can't get enough out of that half middle and that top matzah for everybody. So then there are 2 alternatives. Either you just take extra matzah out of the box and you make sure everyone gets a little bit from each of those 2. Or another solution is you can create like additional mini leaders, if you will. And, every other adult male at the table can have his own set of 3 matzahs. And then you have multiple sets to work with and let them, share. That would be the other way to go.
Wait. Half of a middle matzah is enough for one, not for 2 people.
Right. So you take, you divide your, let's say for you and Bill. So you take the middle matzah and each of you.
Oh, okay, yeah. You only need a kazayas of the 2 together. You don't need a kazayas as each of the top and the bottom. Okay.
Well, meaning, I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. The 2/5 is 2 kazasim, without getting too complicated, according to what you need. So that's the 1/5 and 1/5 is really 1 kazayis each.
Right, right, okay, that's, yeah.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
one for the top of the sandwich, one for the bottom. Okay, that's how I understand. Now I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that pretty much covers the motzi matzah. So you're reclining. So you take your 3 matzahs, just to review. You make the bracha of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Then you make the bracha of al achilas matzah, and then you take your pieces from the top and the middle matzah, and then you recline. Don't forget to recline, and then you chew it up, and then you start to swallow, and you try to have some type of sense of how long it's taking you, that it shouldn't take you too long. So now that is it for matzah. Maror, we already discussed in the previous class. What immediately follows maror is the korach sandwich. The korach sandwich is really a repeat. It's really not its own requirement. It's a repeat of matzah and of maror. The reason why we do it is because Hillel, as we recite in the Haggadah, Hillel was of the opinion that these 3 mitzvahs of matzah, maror, and Pesach, carbon Pesach, have to be done together. And therefore, we make a sandwich and we eat the matzah and the maror specifically together. And even though we've already fulfilled our obligation before we got there, we do that to remember Hillel. And that's why when we eat the korach sandwich, we specifically mention that this is a remembrance for Hillel, who was of the opinion that you have to eat them together. And that's printed right there in the Haggadah. Now, the korach sandwich doesn't have any of the, it's missing the lechem mishnah component of the motzi matzah. So when you get to the korach sandwich, you don't need 2 kazesim, you only need 1. So for the korach sandwich, your matzah, like a quarter of a hand matzah, is plenty. You don't need 2/5. And the matzah used for the korach sandwich, this time it's from the 3rd matzah, right? We started with 3. We had the top one, the middle one was split in half. Now we're eating from the bottom one, the 3rd one. Okay? That's what you use for the korach sandwich. The amount of maror stays the same, because for the maror, the first time around, we only ate 1 kazayis, because there was no reason to eat anything more than that. So now that we're eating our korach sandwich, we're going to do exactly the same thing again. Only 1 kazayis is enough.
Only 1 kazayas.
Yeah. Okay. And again, the korach sandwich, you follow the same procedure as far as how to do it. The maror, you dip in the charoses and you shake it off, and then you put it in there with your matzah, and you recline while you're eating it on your left side, just like you do with the matzah. Okay, so that's it for the magid, the matzah, the korach sandwich, and now we're up to we are now up to the meal, essentially. And the meal, there's no real special requirements. It's like any other Yom Tov meal. You know, have something that you're going to enjoy. Try not to overeat so that when you get to the afikoman, you still have a little bit of room for the afikoman. But you are supposed to eat the afikoman specifically after you're full. That's why it's saved for the end.
You have to hide it.
Do you have to hide it? That's a great question. There's no, I mean,
Kids.
yeah, there's no real halachic thing about hiding it. It's that's another more modern minhag that is developed to keep the kids engaged, and it's especially powerful because it keeps them anxious, keeps them in suspense until all the way at the end. So you know, it's really a powerful tool. But no, there's no real thing about it. But hey, you know, if it's, I can imagine you would have fun with that, so go for it. It's not going to hurt. The afikoman is really a substitution. The afikoman is eaten as a remembrance for the kazayas of Pesach that we would be eating if we would be able to bring a carbon Pesach. Everyone is required to eat a minimum of a kazayas from the paschal lamb. Obviously, we're not allowed to do that today. So the afikoman takes its place. And therefore, that's why the afikoman is at the end of the meal, because that's when you would eat the carbon Pesach. The carbon Pesach is nechal al hasova. It's eaten when you're already full, when you're already somewhat full. And therefore, the afikoman is specifically saved for the end for that reason. It's also a kazayas is what you eat, not the double kazayas. So that'd be like the korach sandwich. And which matzah you eat is obviously that half a matzah that you've been saving all the way from the beginning of your Seder. You're supposed to specifically eat from that matzah. If that half piece is not enough for everyone at your Seder, so then you give everyone a small piece of that, and then more matzah from the box to make up their kazayas. And again, this is eaten while reclining again on your left side. The afikoman has a special halacha that you're not supposed to eat anything after the afikoman. And so bear that in mind if you're still thirsty, or if you didn't have your Pesach dessert yet. You want to get that in before the afikoman. The trickiest thing with afikoman is timing. The afikoman needs to be eaten before chatzos halayla, before midnight, halachic midnight, which in Cincinnati is not such a challenge because zmanim are pretty late here. So midnight here in Cincinnati is 1:39 a.m. So if you can get it, you need to make sure to get it in before that. But with the fact that you start late and there's a lot to do, and Magid, if it goes well, could go for a long time, and then you have a whole meal that you want to enjoy after the Magid, it could very easily get late quickly. So you want to bear that in mind, and you want to make sure to pace yourself carefully for the Magid and for the meal, so that you can enjoy yourself and still get to afikoman on time. If it's possible and you're not really pushing yourself to get the afikoman in on time, it's really ideal to get the afikoman in early so that you could finish Hallel, which immediately follows, that's the end of the Seder, that's what immediately follows the meal, is the Hallel. It's ideal to complete the Hallel before Chatzos as well, before midnight. So that's an important thing to remember. And I mentioned the carbon Pesach. I just want to toss in there something about the shank bone we haven't discussed. The shank bone really could be anything. It's supposed to be roasted. That's the only thing that really matters, and it's supposed to have a bone in it. Some people use a drumstick. Some people use a chicken wing. Yeah, it doesn't really matter exactly what it is. But ideally, it should be roasted or if you boiled it to, just kind of singe the end a little bit. Some people take that approach.
Use a match. Use a match if you don't have gas.
Yeah, you can use a match. You could probably stick it on a long fork and hold it near the electric burner, and that might singe the end of it that way.
Oh, the
But
electric burner will? Okay.
probably, but you want to be careful not to get too close to it. So a match is definitely an option. The actual meat that's served at the Pesach meal is specifically not allowed to be roasted. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have a roast. It means that it can't be roasted. The reason for this is it's not supposed to resemble the Korban Pesach, because we don't want to have even the slightest implication that we're trying to do the real thing when we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. That's the reason for that. So a wet roast would be fine. If you got a brisket, that's a roast, but because it's not cooked the same way as the Korban Pesach is roasted over fire. A wet roast brisket is sitting in juice for most of the way up. That is not considered a dry roast, and that's fine. So that is fine. For that reason, we do not eat the shank bone, assuming it was roasted. We do not eat the shank bone at the Seder. We point to it, we talk about it, but we don't eat it at the Seder itself. On the second day of Yom Tiv, you want to have it if you want to eat your shank bone during the daytime at lunch, that would be a good time to eat your shank bone. That'd be when you're allowed to do it. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording right here.